Hello again, this is Katrina Kramlich from Inspired Spectrums, and in this video I want to talk a little bit about the brain science behind autism. We live in a time where we are learning constantly about autism. The field of autism is still relatively new. We're learning a lot about it every single day, and a lot of what we're learning is exciting for me because it backs up a lot of the techniques that I'm using, and it really helps me understand why they work. And because it helps me, I think it might help other people, and so I want to share that with you. So the first thing to know about when you're working with the mind of a child with autism is that if you've met a child with autism, you've met one child with autism. So what that means, people like to say that a lot, but what that means is that every single child with autism is different. It's called autism spectrum disorders because it's a whole spectrum of challenges, of abilities, of sensory difficulties, of talents and exciting things. So what we tend to see kids who have abilities all over the place, and some of them might be really high in certain areas and might be low in other areas. So it's a very big spectrum. Every single child is different. So if you've ever worked with a child with autism before, what you used for that child may not work with this one, and what you've seen with this student may not work with another student. So it's it's tricky. It's a tricky field, and that's why I feel that play-based therapy, in which we can really customize our techniques for the individual child, really works best, right? So just want to say that to start off with. Another thing, okay, so this is exciting. Another thing that we found out in our brain science here with autism is that children with autism have difficulty pruning their brain fibers. So to explain this more, I'm going to go more in depth. So when you're born, as a newborn baby, you actually have so much gray matter. Your brain is capable of understanding and sensing so many different things, right? And that's because we as humans actually need a wide variety of capabilities, because you don't know where you're going to be born. You could be born in Japan in the middle of this crazy city. You could be born in Africa where there's not as much stimulation. You could be born here in America. And every place that you're born, you're going to need different survival tactics and different things in order to understand. And so as a baby, you have all this capability and all these potentials in your brain fibers. Now, as you get older, a lot of people think your brain grows as you get older, but actually you get rid of a lot of that stuff because your brain becomes more efficient at being able to use what is important to your exact brain. So you don't need to know how to say the sound that they say in Germany. You may not need to protect yourself from predators, as in some bush countries. I don't really know what other brains need to interpret, but basically as you get older, your brains prune away things that are not going to be as helpful for your precise survival. For some reason, this is not happening as much in children with autism. So their brains are keeping on all of these extra synapses and fibers, which is actually making it a lot more difficult for them to process and to understand what may be going on, because their brain is taking in too much information. So somebody explained it to me like this, and it was really helpful. So imagine that your brain is like New York City, right? And your one little synapse over here is trying to communicate with somebody over on the other side of the city, and then wants to make a phone call. In order to make a phone call, it has to call every single person in New York City until it tries to figure out, boop, this is who I'm trying to call, right? And actually, after it makes that connection, it gets rid of the other ones. It says, okay, I know who I'm calling, and that's what it is. But when that doesn't happen with child with autism, you have all these extra brain fibers. So every single time they're trying to make that phone call, it's going all over. So if we were to give you a more concrete example of that now, let's say that you're trying to communicate with a child with autism. If you're talking to a typical person, let's say I'm asking you a question, I may simply say, what's your name? You hear my words, you interpret my words, you may see my facial expression and interpret my facial expression. See that I'm asking a question, formulate a response, get your breath into that, your sounds, your teeth, your tongue, all the aspects of talking, you put it all together and you come out with a response. And that actually happens pretty instantaneous for you because your brain is already pruned and pretty efficient. So I ask you a question, you respond. doesn't work like that for a child with autism because their brain has all these extra synapses, so it's still trying to figure out what's happening a lot of the time. So you ask a question and then finally it may be able to respond. So what that means is that when you're working with a child with autism, you're going to need to give them a lot more time to process what's happening. You want to make it easy for them to process. You want to take away a lot of that extra stimulation, which is one of the reasons that we work in a non-distracting playroom, because we want to take away all that extra input to make it easy for them to focus on us. And another thing you want to just do is give them a lot of time to really process what you're saying. In fact, some kids have said that if you ask a question when they're in the middle of thinking of their response, that totally sort of short circuits their brain and they have to go through the whole process again. So you want to give them a long time to sort of understand what you're saying. Another thing that we know about brains of children with autism is that they tend to have a much bigger amygdala, and the amygdala is the front portion of the brain that processes emotions. And one of the primary emotions that we tend to see with children with autism is fear and anxiety, and that may be due to the bigger amygdala. So they tend to, and it might be due to the sensory system too. I'm going to get into that in the next video. But they tend to not understand what's going on as much, and it results a lot in fear and anxiety. So, you know, we just want to be aware of that and try to be really calm and comfortable ourselves so that we're not adding to that fear. They also have a tendency to make associations that aren't necessarily there. For example, I heard of one man I was talking to had told me that he was at school and he was looking at a person with a blue jacket and the fire alarm went off. And the fire alarm can be very overwhelming for a child with autism. There's a lot of sensory stuff going on there. And from that day forward, every time he saw somebody with a blue jacket, he started to get really, really anxious and nervous. And it was simply due to this sort of false association. So a lot of times we may not understand why a child is reacting the way they're doing, what's happening for them. And if we bring our own frustrations into that, that's going to make it a lot harder. So remaining calm and focused ourselves is going to make it a lot easier for our children to take care of themselves. And I'll get into more of that later. But this is the most exciting part of brain research and autism, is that we know that the brain is plastic. What that means is that it is completely capable of change and rewiring itself all the time. Now, of course, it needs to have specific stimulation and encouragement and motivation. You know, the child wants to see these changes and they're working hard at changes and you're giving them the right opportunity. But this is really exciting because it means that the potential is there for every child all of the time. You can actually have a stroke, wipe out half of your brain that does all the thinking, talking, all the logical aspects of it. And still, this has been done many times, use this half of your brain, this part is now damaged, and relearn all of that stuff and be able to talk again, walk again. There's actually great books on it. So it's pretty amazing what the brain is capable of, and the brain controls everything. So there is infinite possibilities for all children all the time, and it is really important that you remember that. So hopefully that is helpful for you guys, knowing a little bit more about the brain science with autism. And next we're going to talk about the sensory system.